Welcome back to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin, and I am joined by the husband, Matthew the Great. Sorry, Matt, I had to give you a kingly moniker.
I don't like the idea of a great moniker. Can't I have something that's a little bit less intimidating? How do I live up to that?
Did you want the unready? You could share that with Ethelred, but you're never unready.
That's a good joke.
No, you could be Matthew the Ready. You are always prepared.
Well, I am ready to learn about this time period because it's definitely not an era where I cannot pretend to have any expertise in this period whatsoever.
I think we will cover some stuff today that you do know. I know you know the Battle of Hastings. That I think you will know, as most people who know anything about history do. You at least know the name of the Battle of Hastings, if not everything about it. We're back to finish up the story and the life of King Harold. Before we get in, I did want to thank you all for your ongoing support. Every comment, every review, it means so much to us. And if you haven't reviewed the podcast yet, this is your reminder to do so. You can rate, review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want more content, we do have a Patreon. All those links are in the episode description. Now, on to the episode. And just a reminder, any quotes will be from the book, The House of Godwin, The Rise and Fall of an Anglo-Saxon Dynasty, unless otherwise stated. If you're at all interested in Harold or any of the material we covered so far in this part and in the first part, go read it, pick it up. It's a great read. To recap, though, we left off in part 1 with Earl Godwin, Harold's father, dying after a meal with his sons and the king, Edward the Confessor. This left Harold, the heir to Godwin's immense fortune and earldom of Wessex. So before we dive back into the action, we should get to know Harold better. Last episode, he was a minor character even in his own story. So as Harold becomes our main character at long last, I think this is a good place to pause and ask, who was this man? What was he like? We do get some detail in terms of the chronicles about his personality and what he was like. The Life of Edward, which was a chronicle commissioned by Queen Edith, Harold's sister, gives us some insight into Harold at this pivotal moment in his life. Just to keep in mind, it is his sister who had this written. So while it's not always flattering, Edith wanted her family to look good. It's not a total puff piece, to use modern language. The chronicle is certainly tilted to make them look better than they probably were. So just the standard caveat. That said, this is where we thankfully get some personality on Harold, especially when compared to his younger brother, Tostig. More on the contrast between the brothers soon. For now, we're going to stick with Harold as a man and as a courtier. Harold was tall, taller than Tostig, handsome and graceful. He could function on little sleep and food, giving the impression of someone tireless and full of energy, very much in the mold of his father, Godwin. Meanwhile, me, as a hangry insomniac, can only dream that Jamie's future chronicler would write the same about me. I wish I was that person. I am not that person, as you well know, Matthew.
Yeah, I do have direct evidence. That's not you. Maybe someday.
Yeah, they would not say that about me. They would say, she's okay if you get her a lot of sleep and a lot of food, but otherwise, maybe not so much.
You are more than okay with the appropriate allowance of sleep and food.
But I'm even better with it. The Chronicle calls Harold a champion of the law. If you were a thief or a robber or a disturber of the peace, you were, quote, threatened with the terrible face of a lion. No, Matt, I don't think we have another Edith Swan neck situation here. I'm pretty sure the chronicler didn't meet Harold literally spouted a lion face.
Makes me wonder, though, because, we're in the middle of spooky season. Halloween is less than 2 weeks away. And
that would be perfect.
That happens in What We Do in the Shadows quite a bit. The Beast.
If somebody wants to go as Harold, perhaps you could get like a little lion face, do something like that, just spitballing there. And then somebody else could go as Edith Swanneck. Perfect couple's costume. Hey, could be our couple's costume.
And not something we'd have to worry about for trick-or-treating, obviously, because we're too old for that, so we wouldn't have to explain. Would you like to tell listeners that occasionally you had to explain your Halloween costumes?
I had very niche ones. I did go as Louisa May Alcott and Jo March in 2 different Halloweens during my Little Women phase in elementary school. Oh, so definitely would have gone as Harold if I had known about him.
And then in a not so great but revealing moment for LucasArts, your sister was Princess Leia, but that left you with the only other prominent female character in Return of the Jedi.
I was Ula, who was in Return of the Jedi for 0.5 seconds before she dies.
The slave girl who tumbles to her death in Jabba the Hutt's palace.
I'd put tights on my head and I'd pretend I was Ula. We'd go out to the playground and I'd wear my tights on my head. Really cool. Good phase of my life.
So speaking of treacherous palaces, you're about to describe one to us now, right? How's that for... That's a teacher segue right there. That's how we steer people back onto the lesson plan.
We're going to give a good quote from the life of Edward. I do think that this gives you the make of the man. In the strength of his body and mind, Harold stood forth among the people like a second Judah Maccabee. A true friend of his race and country, he wielded his father's powers more actively and walked in his ways, that is, in patience and mercy, with kindness to men of goodwill. End quote. I don't know if you want to tell anybody who might not know who Judah Maccabee is.
The Maccabees were, it's a very strange reference for him to use. So when you look at the tragic history of that corner of the world, one of the problems for the ancient Jewish state is that it's in a very crowded neighborhood. So every time you turn around, there are Assyrians or Babylonians or Greeks or Romans at the doorstep. But in this particular case, right between, this harkens back to a previous podcast, during the period where post-Alexander the Great, when the Ptolemaic dynasties try to rule the little fragments of his kingdom.
Mm-hmm. The Ptolemaic, the last of which was Cleopatra, the 7th, a.k.a. the Cleopatra that we know about.
Right. Which is back to a blind spot in my own historical knowledge. But because I do teach comparative religion, I can talk to you about Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who tried to essentially cultivate worship of himself over the objections of his, what he saw as his Jewish subjects. So the Maccabees staged this epic revolt, and they managed to retake Jerusalem and expel the Greek presence. But prior to the Greeks' departure, although this is kind of history, kind of folklore, the Greeks decide to desecrate the temple. It's the aftermath of that incident that gives us kind of the scaffolding for the story of Hanukkah.
I'm assuming being compared to Judah Maccabee is a good thing.
It's a good thing. It's just kind of a tragic interlude because the Maccabean revolt resecures Jewish independence, but only briefly, because then before you know it, the Romans are there. But maybe there's a parallel there.
There is. This is the last hurrah, the last dynasty, really, of the Anglo-Saxons, the last great dynasty, and it's on its way out. So I think there's a comparison there. And fair to say, the Harold presented there sounds impressive, living up to his father's legacy while cementing his own. This is a man you would want ruling an earldom. This is a man you might want as king, if we can hint at his future. He had all the advantages, the traits of a king, all but one. The crown itself. While Harold must have been adapting to his new reality of being the head of the Godwin family, his father Godwin's death probably was a relief to one man, Edward the Confessor, the king. After all, Harold did not have that same pull that his father had. It would take time for Harold to build up the kind of influence, the kind of power base that his father Godwin had amassed over 3 decades working at the court. That's not to say that Harold did not wield real power. Working alongside his sister, Queen Edith, Harold helped steer the king and the kingdom. As with Godwin, there's this endless historical debate about just how much Harold ruled. Was he effectively king in all but name? How much did Edward, the Confessor, actually do himself? And maybe it was not just a matter of being overpowered by Harold. Maybe Edward chose it that way. The book says, quote, rather than grudgingly yield authority to them. A different perspective could be that he, Edward, instead happily allowed them to take some burdens from his shoulders, end quote. So you could see it either way. Either Harold and Edith are really running the show, whether Edward likes it or not, or Edward at this point in his life is like, it's been a long, rough road to get me to this throne, and now I'm just going to enjoy the perks of being king and let Harold and my wife do the actual ruling.
Coast for a while.
Yeah, it could be either one. It seems to me that nothing was approved without Harold's knowledge. We shouldn't discount Harold's sister, Queen Edith, either. While her reputation has been of like this beautiful and peaceful queen, which is one that she cultivated in the Chronicle, that is absolutely whitewashed. We know she was involved along with their brother Tostig in at least the assassination of one man. Edith, girl, I did not know you had it in you, at least one assassination. Speaking of Tostig, the second oldest Godwinson, he was starting to make a name for himself, like his brother and father before him. He became Earl of Northumbria in 1055, a gift from the king, which gave him an earldom to rival his brother Harold's. Northumbria would be a much different beast than the southern earldoms. Tostig would soon find out. The other two younger Godwinsons, Leofwine and Gareth, would get their own earldoms as well. The Godwinsons were everywhere you looked, just as their father Godwin had intended. There were really very few areas in the realm which they did not control. Only the area of Mercia was out of Godwin control. They had all the other earldoms. Harold would be the richest man in England besides the king. The king had more land, but if you combine the entire Godwinson family land and money together, it dwarfed even the monarch. So they are really making, I don't even want to say a power base for themselves. I mean, it is basically the whole kingdom, save Mercia. And even Mercia, they'll soon have connections to. With Harold pretty much running the kingdom, King Edward the Confessor increasingly retreated to religion. This is where the legend of Edward as the saintly, almost otherworldly figure began to take shape. You start to see the excuses being planted about why Edward and Edith never had children. Maybe it was because Edward wanted to live a chaste life, to live like a monk, that they had never consummated the marriage because later his wife, Edith, would claim she died a virgin.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to fit the evidence, at least for the early marriage. I mean, it is pretty clear that the two had tried for children, that they had tried for heirs, but this is a good story for Edward to tell if he wanted to craft his legacy. At this point in the church, to be married means that you're willfully sinning. Even if you're having sex in a lawful marriage, you're not living as...
Your life could be more pious. Your disposition could be holier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting Pauline ethics in our podcast.
We're still at that time.
That's a debate within Christianity, but certainly the argument could be made that there's an interpretation of the faith that's very robust by the Middle Ages, which argues that just as Paul, as far as we can tell, when he's writing to the early Christian communities, he's essentially telling them, if you are married, stay married. If you're not married,
don't do it.
Don't get married.
Don't do it.
But basically, don't make any long-term plans because the world is about to end. The skies will open. The kingdom of God is at hand, right? But then you fast forward centuries later, and certainly a life of renunciation, a monastic life, although it eventually creates structural problems for the church because sometimes these mystics, these monks, and even nuns come to be perceived as commanding greater holiness, greater piety, greater influence than the structural hierarchy of the church. That's a theme that you see in English history. Famously, there's an incident involving a sword and a meddlesome priest.
He's definitely on the list. At some point, we're going to cover that priest and probably that king.
Not that the trajectory of his life was headed down this monastic destination from the beginning, but he apparently had a change of heart.
Very.
Became much more committed to the authority of the church once he had that job.
Yep.
Anyway, so apparently there's a little bit of piety and politics going on here in our story.
Yeah, I think he's really trying to craft as he's approaching his older years. He's thinking about his legacy, and this is the explanation for there are no heirs. But again, I did want to say that historically, most historians look back and say that was not Edward's intention from the beginning. We talked about him marrying one of the Godwins, Edith, Godwin's daughter. Obviously, there was a political aspect to that to get part of this really powerful dynasty, but there's also the very biological aspect, which was he's marrying a much younger woman. He's doing that because then you get plenty of heirs. But at this point, no heirs have come. He's unable to divorce his wife because she's a Godwin. And so now this is part of his myth building. He's building up what we will think of now when we think of Edward the Confessor as this very religious man who always had his eye towards God. Probably not, at least not in the beginning. And nothing captures Edward the Confessor's preoccupation with his legacy, both spiritual and secular, more than the most famous and enduring building project of his reign, the construction of a grand new abbey in the Norman style, what we now know as Westminster Abbey. So if you've been there, you surely have seen pictures of it or watched a royal wedding at Westminster. It's not the same Westminster Abbey that stands today. That version was built by King Henry III, who was an Edward the Confessor fanboy, so much so that he named his son after him. However, there are supposedly a few aspects from Edward's church that still remain.
Well, if you're going to leave behind a footprint, I mean, that's...
hell of a thing to do.
Those are big boots.
Yeah, Edward wasn't solely focused on his afterlife. While he built a monument to his faith, he was making plans for what was to come next for England, plans that would inevitably impact Harold's future too. As we said, without any children or ability to divorce his wife since she was a Godwin, Edward the Confessor had to start thinking of who would come next on the throne. The topic of succession must have been on everybody's minds, including the king. He had come to the throne already in middle age. Now he was nearing the end of his 50s, a good age for the time. Sure, Edith was still in her childbearing years. Remember, she's about half his age, but nobody expected a child at this point after so many years of their marriage. From what we can tell, Edward the Confessor never put his succession plan into writing. We just have accounts from different people, all with their own agendas, which makes parsing out the truth virtually impossible. But here's what we do know. Edward the Confessor seemed to be leaning towards his Wessex relations. He wanted somebody from his dynasty, his own blood, to sit on the throne after he was gone. Enter Edward the Exile, another Edward I know, but we're going to differentiate them by calling them Edward the Confessor, who's the king, and Edward the Exile, who was the son of the king's half-brother, his nephew. So to explain Edward the Exile's lineage, we're going to have to go back in time a bit. So rewind the tape a little bit to part 1. After Ethelred the Unready, Edward the Confessor's father, died, we spoke about how King Canute, the Danish king, he came over and claimed the English throne. Remember that?
I do.
There was a brief, very brief period of just weeks where Canute shared the throne with Ethelred the Unready's son, Edmund Ironside. He would have been Edward the Confessor's older half-brother, as Edmund was born to an earlier marriage, not to Emma of Normandy. Ethelred had been married before. Edmund Ironside is his eldest son. Canute and Edmund Ironside split up the kingdom, so Edmund Ironside keeping Wessex while Canute took the rest. But then Edmund died soon after, and Canute took over all of it, which is why it's really just a footnote in history. But Edmund did leave children, including Edward the Exile. These children, they were shipped off to Sweden to be killed. But in true fairy tale fashion, their would-be killers took pity and spirited them off to safety in Hungary instead. So years later, in the 1050s, with no heirs of his own, as Edward the Confessor looked around for anyone of the Wessex line, he discovered this lost branch of the family. So he had not known his half-brother's children had survived.
How did he find out?
It just says that by the early 1050s, Edward became aware that they existed.
All right, so maybe we just don't know how it happened. That's certainly possible.
Word got to him that they had survived and that they were now in Eastern Europe. So quite a shock. You're like, okay, I didn't think I had any family left, or at least, any potential heirs. And now you have somebody from the male line. Perfect. Now he knew they were alive and well in Hungary. We're not 100% sure, but it seems that Harold was sent over to Hungary to negotiate the return to England of Edward the Exile, who was about 40 years old at this point. For Edward the Confessor, Edward the Exile might not be an heir of his own body, but at least he would be of the same blood. This is good. He finally has somebody that he wants to follow him on the throne.
So he has kin that he sees as politically legitimate.
Mm-hmm. In 1057, Edward the Exile arrived in England with his family, including a son, Edgar, and a daughter, Margaret. However, Edward the Exile died before even meeting Edward the Confessor. The hazards of medieval travel. He had only lasted a week in England. Poor guy.
Oh my God.
Can you imagine? You're going to be king. You come to England. Gets to England.
No, you're going to die.
A week later. Yeah. Sorry. But that did leave young Edgar, who we usually call Edgar the Etheling, which we mentioned last episode was the Anglo-Saxon name for prince, essentially. So little Edgar, he would have only been a small child, about 6 years old at this time. And he's the only remaining male heir to the powerful Wessex royal dynasty. And if alarm bells are ringing in your brain after another untimely death, we've talked about many of them, you would not be surprised that rumors linger that Edward the Exile was murdered, poisoned, perhaps, by Harold, so he could have the throne for himself. How many young people, or relatively young people in good health, dropped dead last episode? Got another one.
Yeah, I don't see any death here as ever natural causes. To me, it's all mystery now.
It's hard, because if Harold did have designs on the kingship at this early stage, he certainly would have seen Edward the Exile's return as a threat. If anyone had motive, it was Harold. Queen Edith, a Godwin through and through, also could have been involved. Can't discount our girl Edith. We already talked about the fact that she was involved in an assassination. Even if the death does seem awfully convenient, like many of the deaths we talked about, there are problems with the foul play theory. First of all, if Harold really wanted Edward the Exile dead, why not strike before he even reached England? He was on a ship to get to England. Could have easily done away with him there. Why wait till he gets to England? Why go through the effort of bringing him back only to kill him the moment he set foot on English soil?
Yeah, that seems like a lot of work to deliver no fundamental change.
Yeah, like he had a chance, especially if he went to Hungary to sort of broker this agreement to get him back. And the strongest argument against Harold's guilt is simple. Edward's son, Edgar the Etheling, survived. If Harold had been ruthless enough to remove one claimant, why leave another one alive? Whatever the truth is, Edward the Confessor seemed to be grooming young Edgar as heir. He and Queen Edith took the little boy under their wing, raising him at court. He would be the child the two of them never had. And here's where you might have to wonder what Harold made of it all. Surely he realized Edgar might not want him hanging around once he came into his throne. Then again, Harold's own father, Godwin, had served a similar role for Canute when he came over as a foreign ruler. It all just depended on the people around Edgar, if they would let Harold continue in his role as the greatest magnate in the land and king in all but name. But it is setting itself up for perhaps a potential problem down the road if Edgar takes the throne. If Harold had been essentially running the government before, around the years 1063 and 1064 marked more of a change. The king was increasingly stepping back from his role. To quote the book, quote, Edward had virtually retired from the decision-making processes of his administration by 1063 to 1064, including all military matters. So while Edward hunted, prayed, and spent most of his time on his religious pursuits, Harold was the one in a lot of ways actually governing, which meant handling military expeditions as England's neighbors began to create pressure. Wales, for example, was united behind a single king, Griffith ap Llewellyn. It was up to Harold to deal with. These Welsh wars led by Harold showed off Harold's skills as a leader. He excelled at all parts of warfare, the planning, the defenses, all of it. The conflict would effectively end with the Welsh king being betrayed and murdered by his own men in 1063. The head of Griffith ap Llewellyn would be sent to Harold as a prize, which makes for the worst Amazon delivery ever.
Grim.
Yeah. Scotland, too, always looked for trouble around the borders. One Scottish king in particular might sound familiar to you, Macbeth.
Oh,
Don't worry. I can say his name. We're not in a theater. Although if the speed suddenly cuts out or you hear a scream, I'm sorry, Matt.
the curse, the curse.
Well, I said it, so who knows? But yes, he's lurking around at this point.
If you say that, but then you follow that up with like 3 Beetlejuices, does it cancel itself out or?
I think you might just make the curse even worse.
Oh, okay.
It's worth trying. You could try it if you want to say. And then what if I do a Bloody Mary? Then we'll just have summoned everything to our house. I think at that point, our house just becomes the house from The Conjuring.
Oh, is that the junior high? She's supposed to say it into a mirror. Is that how that works?
Mm-hmm.
And what does she do?
I don't know if she's actually supposed to do anything. It's just something you do at sleepovers along with, what is it? Light as a feather, stiff as a board. You probably didn't do that.
Don't remember that one.
I do think it's more of a 90s sleepover thing, like watching Spice World. Anyway, in these early years of the 1060s, you can really see Harold consolidating his power. It's him, not the king, solving problems, keeping order, and running England. Edward the Confessor, he was a figurehead, whether he liked it or not. 1064 would be a turning point, a pivotal year for many reasons. The most important have to do with Harold and a trip to Normandy. Norman sources, including the famous Bayeux Tapestry, claim Edward the Confessor sent Harold to Normandy to promise his cousin, the Duke of Normandy, William, the English throne. William later built his entire claim to England on this very story. Convenient. We should mention what the Bayeux Tapestry is for people who might not know. It is, yes, a tapestry dating from later in William the Conqueror's reign that shows the events of 1064 to 1066, basically what we're talking about in illustrated form. If you go to our Instagram page, you can see parts of the tapestry depicted in the art for this episode. And if you want, you can type it into Google, look at some of the images, and you'll see a lot of the events that we talk about are depicted there.
It's a spelling nightmare for students, but Google will figure out that there's supposed to be an X in there.
Bayeux. It's a useful, if biased, look at this time period. It's evocative, it's colorful. And actually, we'll be back in Britain for the first time in a long time, soon, on loan to the British Museum, starting in September 2026. So our foreign listeners or our listeners who want to take a trip to England, it will be at the British Museum. That is exciting. I know Jamie's seen it in France. I have not, so I'm very jealous of that.
Unlike some of the other items at the British Museum, it probably won't have a little note next to it that says controversy.
It's actually on loan.
Because it's actually theirs. They didn't steal it. I probably shouldn't say that. I've offended some of our British listeners now.
I don't know. Have you seen, there's a TikTok going into the British Museum. It's like, I'm going to stop as soon as I see something that is stolen. And as soon as they get in, there's an obelisk from Egypt. And they're like, okay, shut down, we're done.
Although, truth be told, every American museum is replete with things we have stolen as well. So plenty of shame to go around.
Oh, yeah. We don't have a leg to stand on, unfortunately, as Americans. I think we all know that. To return to Harold and his trip to Normandy, there are other explanations for why Harold might have gone to Normandy, none of which involve him offering William the crown of England upon Edward's death. In fact, the long-believed Norman version of the events might, in fact, be the most implausible. More likely, it's that Harold may have gone to free a younger brother. He's got a lot of them, who was still stuck in Normandy as a hostage from the Godwin exile of 1051. Edward the Confessor had sent the child across the channel to Normandy for safekeeping when he was in conflict with Godwin. After so many years, it seems likely that Harold wanted his family back, his whole family. Another version of the story is that Harold never intended to go to Normandy at all. William of Malmesbury suggests he was blown off course on the way to Flanders. Honestly, the idea that Harold crossed the English Channel just to hand over the crown feels absurd. Why would you do that? Some even argue Harold never went at all. since the English sources besides William of Malmesbury do not mention this trip, only Norman sources. Regardless, the most accepted version is that Harold ended up in Normandy. On the Bayeux Tapestry, you can see him leaving his estate in about March of 1064, having received some orders from Edward the Confessor before going on his travels. What those orders were, we're still guessing all these years later. What William will say later is that Harold is going to give him the crown, the English crown, after Edward dies, which we should be questioning because we already mentioned that Edward the Confessor already seems to have an heir, a young child who he's raising as his heir. Let's follow Harold across the English Channel and introduce this new character into the mix. I know we've had so many, and there's more to come. Duke William the Bastard, better known as William the Conqueror. At this point in time, he has yet to conquer anything, so he's just William, Will to us. Actually, don't call him Will. I don't think he'd like that, and we really don't want to make this man angry. Bad things happen when William is angry. If we're drawing the family tree, you should know that William's related to Edward the Confessor. As I already said, if you recall from part 1, Edward's mother, Emma of Normandy, is from, you guessed it, Normandy, where William was now the Duke. Edward the Confessor himself had spent a large chunk of his life in Normandy, too, in exile when Canute took the English throne and married his mother, Emma. We spoke about how that made Edward the Confessor more Norman than English at the point he became king. So in terms of kinship, Edward the Confessor and Duke William were first cousins once removed, and no, I will not try to reconstruct that family tree. Anytime somebody says cousins removed, my brain can't comprehend how that works, so I will not. What we know is that they are related. And Edward the Confessor had spent time at the previous Duke, Robert's court, who was William's father. Edward the Confessor was much older than William, so they wouldn't have gotten to know each other too well just based on age while he was there. I'm not going to go too far into William, the future conqueror story, because if you've seen the announcement on Instagram, Jamie is going to cover him in our next episode. We're going to go full in on the king and conqueror. We're going to leave it to her to get into all the gory details about Duke William. And believe me, there are plenty. I would say Google about his death and coffin, but I would advise you not to do so when you're eating. Actually, maybe just wait until Jamie's episode. It will be, I was going to say pleasant, but maybe not so pleasant surprise. If you know, you know. As an illegitimate son of the previous Duke of Normandy, William had a hell of a time keeping his dukedom. He had succeeded his father at the age of 7 or 8 years old. So we have another child king, well, in this case, a child duke. The nobles in Normandy and around it often caused problems for the dukes of Normandy, and with a literal elementary schooler at the helm, the result was anarchy. By the time we meet Duke William in 1064, he had persevered through all that, coming out the other side hardened, some would say cruel. He had entered middle age, and he had his eyes on a crown, a throne. To be a duke is one thing, to be a king is another. Harold's trip got off to a bad start. He went ashore in Ponthieu, not Normandy, and the Duke of Ponthieu took him hostage. The wealthiest, most influential man in England falling into your lap. Perfect. Luckily or unluckily, take your pick, Duke William of Normandy took possession of poor Harold, taking him off the Count's hands. Once he got to Normandy, Harold became a hostage to the Duke, Duke William. A well-treated one, but a hostage nonetheless. He was given his own manor, hunted with Duke William, and he even joined him on a campaign in Brittany. You can see some of that on the Bayeux Tapestry, including an episode where Harold rescued 2 Norman knights from quicksand near Mont Saint-Michel. If you've been to Mont Saint-Michel in France, you'll know the quicksand surrounding it is no joke. I've been there. Absolutely gorgeous. Have you been to Mont Saint-Michel, Matthew?
I have not.
I'm going to send you a picture. It is one of the most beautiful places.
Yeah, it looks like you are in another world.
Looks like out of a fairy tale or like giving me Lord of the Rings vibes, something like that. Absolutely beautiful, but a lot of quicksand around it, even now. The most consequential moment also appears on the tapestry. Harold swearing on holy relics to support Duke William's claim to the English throne. That oath would come back to haunt him. There's a story that the Normans had tricked Harold, hiding the relics before showing him them after he swore his oath, which to me, frankly, sounds straight out of a Scooby Doo episode. Having him swear and then pulling out a rug or something and being like, ha, you swore over holy relics. Well,
no take-backs.
Yeah, no take-backsies.
You have to commit.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's how it went down, but I would love to think that is what happened. Of course, this is all coming from the Normans. We weren't in the room, makes it harder to guess. There's also an idea that Harold, if he did swear an oath, that he might have done it in order to leave, that Duke William was not letting him leave until he swore this oath. So could you blame him if he had to take the oath knowing that might be the only way he was able to leave Normandy?
Well, but if it sets up the fall of a dynasty, I don't know if that's a fair trade.
He's got to get back to England. You think he trusts Edward the Confessor to run things while he's gone? If the oath did happen, if it was under duress or coerced in any way, then that could possibly invalidate it. Whatever happened, in the end, Harold was able to finally leave Normandy to return home. Unfortunately for him, there was a situation waiting for him in England. The Godwin family had been remarkably united through their troubles, but that had been in large part due to Earl Godwin. With the powerful Godwin patriarch gone, the fractures in the siblings would start to show. Maybe it was always going to happen. A rivalry between Harold and Tostig feels almost inevitable. Both had their own lands, their own ambitions, and like any other nobleman, they were bound to clash eventually. As the eldest, Harold was the natural leader of the family, but Tostig wasn't without his own advantages. He had the royal couple firmly in his corner. Edward and Edith were Team Tostig all the way. Edith especially seems to have been closer to him. Probably the book mentions because of their similar personalities. They were natural allies. Harold, on the other hand, was much more like their father, Godwin. The character studies in the life of Edward gives us some clues into the differences between the brothers, which might have contributed to the rivalry. I love to have personality descriptions. So again, thank you, Edith, for giving us the life of Edward, because it dives into all these details, which we might not otherwise get, especially in this time period. While both were equally brave, Tostig could be more unpredictable. He was more inflexible and overzealous to the point that he would do something without having planned it. We all know people like that. We probably all have siblings like that. The Chronicle also indicates that Harold sought happiness while Tostig wanted success. This seems maybe a little bit strange. I don't know if we could quite believe it, considering the lengths to which Harold would go to maintain his power. But that is something to mention. They do say Harold just wanted to be happy. Guess it's easy to be happy if you're the richest man in England and basically controlling everything.
The whole thing is so fascinating to me that all the economic power is at his fingertips.
You think that he shouldn't be rich? What do you mean?
No, it's just like the fact that it unfolds this way, that it's not complete seizure of control immediately. He's content to manipulate things from afar.
Which I do think when we get to the judgment piece, that I think that will be part of it, because at this point, if he wanted to, I'm sure he could have done a complete coup, although why, when you're already maintaining the mechanisms of power, do you really need to have the crown itself? But plenty of people have done that in the past, even if they're the power behind the throne. They've decided, let's just get rid of the king itself. He doesn't do that. A lot of the judgment piece will hinge on, as we talk about, how he comes to the throne and that aspect of it. Also the oath, as we already talked about. If you put a lot of stock into the fact that he promised Duke William that he would support him in getting the English throne, then technically that makes him an oath breaker. Technically, he lied, regardless of what William did to get that promise. I think those are the things that we weigh the most when we get to the judgment piece. So these acute differences between the two eldest Godwin sons would become more pronounced as time passed. We talked about in the first part, the childhood episode of Harold hitting Tostig. We get similar, even more far-fetched stories of how complicated the relationship between the brothers had gotten. Henry of Huntingdon's Historia Anglorum tells us that in 1063, quote, in the king's presence in the royal hall at Windsor, as his brother Harold was serving wine to the king, Tostig grabbed him by the hair, for Tostig nourished a burning jealousy and hatred because his brother was higher in the king's affection. Can you imagine? They're just hanging out, having dinner, serving wine, and just Tostig grabbing Harold by the hair. The book hilariously notes that Harold and Tostig would have been close to 40 at this point. Sounds a little bit over the top. That ends with them having some little brawl there in front of the king.
You'd think by that point in their lives they could have come to some kind of more mature way to conduct their rivalry.
I'm just going to say it. Sometimes men aren't always the most mature.
It's probably true.
Sometimes they go towards brute force. I don't know. I'm just thinking there's that episode in Arrested Development where Job and Michael are wrestling in front of the courthouse. That's kind of what I'm seeing here. Again, children fighting like that, as we talked about before. Of course, I could easily see that. Middle-aged men, less likely, though not impossible. But you would think they would have found a better place to take out their aggression than in front of the king. Maybe wait until the ride home or something. And I think the book also mentioned, we already talked about that Tostig actually was the one who was more in favor with the king and the queen. So it doesn't really ring true that he would be jealous. Maybe he'd be jealous that Harold had a lot of power, but Tostig was really the favorite. I think there's a lot that we can doubt about the story, especially since the story continues that Tostig left, went to Harold was preparing another banquet, and then, trigger warning if you don't like to hear about blood and gore, Tostig dismembered all of Harold's servants. So this is taking a true crime turn. We've become Crime Junkie, the podcast.
Why should the servants have to pay for this stupid rivalry?
I don't know. Well, I think that's probably the least surprising thing. People are just disposable at this point in time, especially people of that rank. Well, and the tale ends with Tostig putting a, quote, human leg, head, or arm into each vessel for wine, mead, ale, spiced wine, which is not how I want my wine, with a side of human head or a human arm.
I will take a pass as well.
I'm going to go out on a limb. Bad pun.
Oh, that's a good dad joke.
I'm going to go on a limb and say that this didn't happen. We will see soon, though, why Tostig would have made for good villain material when these stories were written later. These aren't written at the time. They're maybe about a generation later. But Tostig would shoulder the blame for some of what came next for the kingdom and next for the Godwin sons. It would be Tostig Godwinson that would be the catalyst for a new crisis not seen since the days of the Godwin family's exile. The northern nobles had been chafing under Tostig's control as Earl of Northumbria. Some of the issues were due to the fact that Tostig was an outsider. Harold had had a much easier time adjusting to his earldom, as it had been Godwin territory for decades. Not so for Tostig. However, Tostig's personality traits, the ones we just talked about, also undoubtedly played a role in making him the most hated man in the North. He had been brutal at putting down any opposition or perceived opposition. Tostig had gone so far as to order assassinations which Queen Edith, Tostig and Harold's sister, even assisted with. We already mentioned that. Once again, we can see the difference between this beautiful, placid image of Queen Edith presented in chronicles and her actions. The Godwins could be ruthless. And we should not discount that Harold also had this trait. We don't talk a lot about it, but he is a Godwin too. We shouldn't discount that from him. However, these assassinations might have deepened that widening cavern between Tostig and Harold. When he found out about his siblings' involvement in the assassinations, Harold must have been furious. Tostig hadn't just acted rashly, He'd acted stupidly with no thought for the fallout and what would come next. Classic Tostig. Queen Edith herself admitted in the Life of Edward that Tostig was volatile and impulsive. But this murdering men, especially murdering men under promises of safe conduct, which is what Tostig did, crossed the line, especially for someone like Harold. It wasn't just reckless, it was dishonorable. And for Harold, that might have been the moment the fragile bond between the brothers finally broke. Harold would not be the only one upset at, to quote Game of Thrones, the North remembers. By behaving so appallingly, Tostig had made a lot of enemies. Neither Tostig nor King Edward the Confessor seemed to grasp just how bad things had gotten. They carried on as usual, blissfully unaware that an insurgency had begun to muster against Tostig. Meanwhile, Harold was distracted in the summer of 1065, dealing with Welsh raiders who had robbed his new hunting lodge and killed his workers. Rude. Helps hard enough to find these days. While Tostig and the king happily hunted together and Harold wrestled with his own issues in his domains, the North erupted. On October 3rd, Northumbrian rebels stormed York, wiping out Tostig's supporters and seizing his treasury, conveniently full from the most recent round of tax collections. The citizens of York welcomed the uprising and its rebels. We should not think of it as a sack of the city. The violence was targeted at Tostig's supporters alone. 200 of Tostig's men were cut down in a last stand by the River Ouse in York. The North was clear. Tostig Godwinson was not their earl. Not anymore. They declared him an outlaw and replaced him with Morcar, the younger brother of Edwin, Earl of Mercia in his own right. We talked about the only earldom that was not owned by the Godwins. It's owned by Edwin, and now they're putting his brother Morcar into the earldom of Northumbria instead of Tostig. Morcar and Edwin, the two brothers, would combine to be the leaders of this anti-Tostig faction in the north. King Edward the Confessor flew into a rage at the news as he quickly called his council to decide what to do next. William of Malmesbury in his chronicle said that the uprising had, quote, angered the king who was much attached to Tostig, but he was handicapped by illness and burdened with old age and an object of contempt already. This is back to Edward the Confessor, king in all but name. So it's going to be Harold who's going to have to deal with it, not the king. And Harold went north to deal with this looming threat. In retrospect, he might not have been the best man for the job. You have sibling rivalry on steroids between Tostig and Harold. While we don't know what was going through Harold's mind, I think we can say that Harold might not have wanted to make the situation easy for his brother. In fact, this was a perfect opportunity to exploit. So much for family unity. We're not positive on what transpired, but Harold might have been colluding with these northern lords Morcar and Edwin, because we know later on he ended up marrying their sister.
Convenient.
Yep, this marriage might have been in works for a while. It might have come up at this time, so maybe a little quid pro quo, perhaps. I'll marry your sister if you continue to make hell for my brother. We have to leave open the possibility that Harold was more than happy to side with these northern lords against his own brother. If we want to be fair to Harold, though, the other side is the marriage contract could also have been worked out as a way to pacify these northern lords. Whether or not Edward the Confessor and Tostig knew about it, who knows? We don't know if they knew about the marriage at this point. If Tostig did find out about it, you could see why he might have thought Harold did not have his best intentions in mind. Edward the Confessor initially wanted to fight on Tostig's behalf. He wanted to go to bat for his boy. Tostig, after all, was the favorite of the king and the queen. The mood of the country was bleak. The men around the king and the queen wanted to save them from themselves, from making a decision that would splinter and anger the already irate North even more. There was one thing for certain. Civil war would be too costly. No, a diplomatic solution had to be the answer. The chronicles do indicate that Harold really did want a reconciliation between Tostig and the Northumbrians. Quote, if he could, but he could not. With no possibility of reconciliation then, Harold would be among the men who unanimously spoke against restoring Tostig to his earldom. The council and the king made their decision. Tostig would have to give up his earldom and go into exile. We're not clear why exile was necessary. After all, he had not committed treason against the king. He had beef with the other Northumbrians, the people of his earldom, but not necessarily the king. We think there must have been some sort of epic falling out, something personal that happened between Edward the Confessor, Tostig, and Harold, some sort of event that would have triggered this exile. We just don't know what. Tostig knew the man to blame for his misfortunes for this exile. Not the king, not even the northern lords who ousted him. No, it was his brother Harold. He would never forgive his older brother for this transgression, this splicing of family loyalty. This is where we can ask, was Tostig right to blame Harold for the loss of his earldom? The answer is maybe. Harold and the other Godwin brothers could have marched north, crushed Morcar and Edwin, and forced Tostig back into power. Harold had the military skill, as we've already talked about. He certainly had the money. He could have done it if he wanted to. But Harold was nothing if not pragmatic. He knew even if he won, the same grievances would flare up again. He knew his brother. But did Harold betray his brother, cutting a secret deal with the northern lords, Edwin and Morcar, or did he just simply agree with the council, the Wittan's assessment that peace must be bought, no matter the price? In this case, the price of an earldom. We'll never know at this point. If I had to guess, I would say it was a little bit of both for Harold. In the moment, it was the wise political move, the move that Godwin, his father, might have made too if he was still alive, trying to get a peace for the country, not just for their family. We could add in the succession piece as well to play devil's advocate if Harold was already eyeing the throne after Edward the Confessor's death. Exiling Tostig, the favorite of both king and queen, would have been a good move. Tostig gone would mean one less rival for the throne once Edward the Confessor finally died. Whatever the reasoning, Harold's decision to not use his clout and his considerable military might to restore Tostig cracked the Godwin family wide open. Tostig never forgave Harold. Whatever sibling rivalry had happened before this, now it sparked anger, even hatred.
It's not a rivalry at this point. There's going to be active conspiring against one another now.
Exactly.
Even if that involves alliances with foreign powers, yeah.
I don't know if we want to talk about it now or if you want to wait till the judgment. Do you blame Harold for what he's doing to Tostig at this point? Or do you want to talk about that later?
There's a part of me that's like, well, we think of nations and states and families as fundamentally distinct entities, right? But this is not that kind of world. This is a world where kinship across borders that we now consider to be very static and defined is really common. You know, even a sense of Englishness is still relatively new. So I don't know. I guess I'm not gonna judge him too harshly.
He had the money, and then there's the other brothers, Leofwine and Gareth, that could have helped. They had their own earldoms. They could have all combined and helped put them back in. But as we said, wouldn't that just be setting yourselves up for the same thing to happen probably months, years down the line?
Right. I consider them to be short-sighted.
Who? Harold?
Well, definitely Tostig.
You're with Harold on this. You feel like he acted justly. He should not have. To be fair, it wasn't just him. The Wittan, the council, everybody agreed.
Right. And the people he actually was attempting to govern as an earl. So
yeah, they didn't want him.
Heaven forbid they should have a voice.
And to be fair, yeah, at this point, that would probably be the least consideration. Like I said, I would think that even Godwin, the father, would have done something similar. Family is important, but Harold would have known what happens in Northumbria could spread. It could become an even bigger problem if they could not find a way to manage it. And Tostig, he would be the sacrificial lamb, although, once again, it was his fault. It's not like these problems came out of nowhere. He created them. Should we blame Harold for mopping up the trouble, even if it meant one of his family members losing something in exchange. But quickly, Tostig's exile would soon be outweighed by an even greater threat to the stability of the nation. Within weeks of Tostig's exile, King Edward the Confessor's health deteriorated rapidly. Once active, even in his early 60s, with days full of hunting, by early November, the king's sudden decline was obvious. The following month, in December, Edward the Confessor suffered a series of strokes. Though he managed the Christmas service and banquet, his beloved abbey, the Westminster Abbey's consecration, was moved up to December 28th, fearing the king would not make it past then. Around the dying king gathered Harold and his brothers, everyone but the exiled Tostig. It feels very much like circling the wagons. The much-feared moment of succession was nearly upon them. King Edward the Confessor made it to the year 1066, but just barely. On January 5th, 1066, the king languished on his deathbed. Before his final rest, the confessor supposedly uttered to Harold, "I commend this woman," his wife Edith, "with all the kingdom to your protection." And then King Edward the Confessor was gone. We can debate what Edward, may he rest in peace, meant, if he really did say that. Those were his last words. Did Edward the Confessor give Harold the kingship on his deathbed, or was he simply giving Harold custody, so to speak, of Harold's sister, the now Queen Dowager Edith? Technically, Edward the Confessor could not just give anyone the throne. That had to be ratified through the Witan, the council. So that's even if we're going back to Duke William the Conqueror's claim. You can have an heir, certainly, but the Witan, they have the final say.
So they have their own kind of prologue to the act of succession.
You could certainly say that this is who I want, but the Witan get the final say. Do you think I commend this woman with all the kingdom to your protection? Do you think that means the crown's yours, baby?
Well, it sounds definitive to me.
It does. People have debated this deathbed statement for centuries. It does seem shocking to think that there is no conclusion about succession either way. I just think of the stress and the anxiety that Queen Elizabeth I's final years would bring when there was no heir, no real succession plan in place. It would be just as bad here, if not more. England needed a king. An interregnum, a time between kings, meant lawlessness and disorder. If Edward the Confessor had wanted Edgar the Etheling, the child he had taken under his wing years ago, at this point, young Edgar had only reached his 15th birthday. Plus, despite being taken in by the king and queen, he's still very much an outsider and a young one at that. He did not have the money or the power like Harold commanded. If Edward the Confessor had lived just a few more years, if he had made it just a few more years, the situation might have been much different. There are some hints that perhaps the king had begun to rethink setting up the young Edgar as his heir towards the end of his life. I don't know, the evidence for that seems pretty flimsy to me. We haven't even mentioned the claim of Edward's relative, Duke William of Normandy. We talked a little bit about that, but Duke William would maintain for the rest of his life that England had been promised to him by his kinsman, a promise that Harold had sworn to uphold. Like I said, Jamie's going to cover William the Conqueror. So she's going to talk more about the claim and where that all comes from. But I will say that contrary to what Duke William would want us to believe, it appears to me that he was far from King Edward the Confessor's mind at the point of his death.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty flimsy claim.
I didn't talk about in part one, but there was some speculation that around the time of the Godwin's exile that William came to England. Not everybody believes that, and some people think that's when Edward first floated the idea. Some people don't think that happened at all. Honestly, I don't think he was thinking about William at all. To me, it appears that Edward the Confessor still wanted Edgar the Etheling, his bloodline, on the throne. Of course, that was not to be. It would be Harold, the Earl of Wessex, son of Godwin, who would wear the crown. A man who had everything to offer as king except his bloodline. Within hours of King Edward the Confessor's burial, Harold would be crowned. This speed is very unusual for the time. A coronation would usually occur months after ascension. We think of coronations happening pretty soon after somebody becomes king. Not so much at this point. Many people point to this very quick coronation. Some people even say that they did the funeral and the coronation at the same time.
Ooh, that's in poor taste.
We don't know, but there's a possibility that happened. Matt's like, I was with Harold up until this point, but he's out now.
Although he probably feels like there's an urgent need to get the interregnum over with and cohere around the new threat, because he knows, obviously, there's danger across the channel.
A lot of people point to this as perhaps being sped along to cover up the fact that Harold should not have been named king. That's what the Norman side thought was the case. So William of Poitiers, who is not Duke William of Normandy. I know there's a lot of repeating names, but he would later write, quote, "This mad Englishman, Harold, could not endure to await the decision of a public election. But on the tragic day when that best of men was buried, he violated his oath and seized the royal throne with acclamation, with the connivance of a few wicked men," end quote. I'll say William of Poitiers, not a fan of Harold, calling him a mad Englishman who violated his oath and seized the royal throne. This quick coronation might have been a smart move, like you said, to calm any immediate concerns about the succession and a dangerous interregnum. But as we know, other claimants to the throne would soon start to make their own moves. After all, in the end, crowns are dangerous things. To steal a line from Shakespeare, one of my favorite lines, "Within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court." And death will be something that will follow Harold here. For 42 weeks, Harold would be king of England. 42 weeks and not a moment of solace or quiet. He rang in the year 1066 by being crowned king in January. By October, he would be dead. This brevity and the fact that his successor, Duke William, better known as William the Conqueror, destroyed much of the documentary evidence of Harold's reign makes it tricky to figure out what kind of king he was. I know when we've had conversations, you were like, how do we even judge him? He was barely a blip on the radar in terms of kingship.
Yeah, that is, I think, a problem.
And, again, the shortness and the fact that a lot of what we would have received from his reign destroyed by his successor. He just didn't have the time to settle in. From the beginning, Harold as king had to mop up problems and prepare for multiple invasions. Still, it's worth noting that William of Malmesbury, who was an Anglo-Norman chronicler, so he had no real affection for Harold, begrudgingly admitted, quote, "Harold might have ruled the kingdom, to judge by the figure he cut in public, with prudence and fortitude, had it come to him lawfully." So it's about as close to a compliment as Harold was going to get from anyone Norman.
He's playing the part.
He would have been a great king if it had come to him lawfully. So still talking about the fact that he, quote unquote, stole the throne.
From William.
Yes. And honestly, I think we can say Harold ruled as well as anyone could in those breakneck, chaotic months of early 1066. Really, if not for the succession question, and yes, that's a huge if, Harold might have been a good, even great king. To quote the book, quote, "From this little evidence from inside England, albeit Anglo-Norman writers, we have a picture of a king who may well have proved to be an exceptional ruler had he lived longer," end quote. Harold had the benefit of essentially already having run the kingdom for years, while Edward the Confessor dabbled in this building projects and religiosity. He literally had the on-the-job training, so it would have been pretty easy for him to transition.
It's back to my whole mystery, though, of why not just
take it,
try to seize power then and have a chance to consolidate and prepare for what's to come. I mean, not obviously that he knew about the William threat his whole life or anything, but
I just feel like the same be said with why didn't Godwin, his father, do it? I think Tosti might have done it if he had had all the power that Harold had done. I just don't think that was the kind of person he was. I think he was fine to, I don't want to say sit in the background, because it's not like he was even in the background. I don't know. He was fine with what he had. And the book says Harold took the energy he had as the Earl and applied it to kingship. So this is a man who, as we said, doesn't need a lot of sleep, doesn't need a lot to eat. He's married to his work. He's a workaholic. You should know that, Matthew. You're a little bit yourself.
Why should I know that?
I'm not saying that in a mean way. I'm saying that you're dedicated to your work.
Oh, yeah. No offense
No,
taken.
I'm just saying he was as dedicated as you were. Somehow, and probably, Harold would find time to marry early in his kingship. By March or April 1066, Harold married, this time in the church. We already spoke last episode about his long-standing relationship with Edith Swanneck and how that differed from the church-sanctioned marriage. So this allowed Harold to make a politically advantageous marriage to another Edith. I think this is our third Edith. Man had a type, and her name was Edith. They aren't Pokemon, Harold. You don't have to catch them all. You don't have to catch all the Ediths. We already mentioned that this Edith was sister to Morcar and Edwin, the men who had tossed Harold's brother Tostig out of his earldom. This Edith had also been married to the Welsh king, whose head Harold had received as a gift, giving this Edith a hint of royal pedigree, even if only by marriage. I don't know, you wonder how she felt being married to the man who was given her previous husband's head. Obviously, nobody's going to ask her. She's a woman. Nobody cares what she thinks. By summer, Queen Edith of Mercia, as she's known, was pregnant with a son who would be named after his father. Unfortunately, Harold would never meet the son, as he was born in 1067 after Harold's demise. Even after this new marriage, Harold continued to be involved with Edith Swanneck, his handfasted wife, too. This is where I'm like, is this the origin of the secret second family? The original second family? Although, to be fair to Harold, I don't think it's exactly secret. I don't think he's keeping it on the down low. What impresses me most is how he managed to keep these two relationships simultaneously with children on both sides, while also handling the stress of kingship and invasion. Gotta hand it to him. Quite impressive. Men, you guys can really do anything if you put your mind to it.
Gee, thanks.
Maintaining two families and a kingship and invasion. Seriously, no wonder he didn't sleep. Man didn't have any time to sleep.
Well, and let's also not forget that as part of this, we get, there's nothing more male than how far this ridiculous claim gets dragged out. Because literally, Puritans are landing in Massachusetts Bay, and the Mayflower Compact still describes their dread sovereign as the rightful king of France. It's like, guys, let's move on. They just won't give it up.
No, it takes a while. It takes a long time for them.
And they're not even fans of the king, but even they feel like, well, you should probably acknowledge it.
That is true. If the marriage was supposed to signal hope for the future, that would not last long. Portents, omens, spelled doom for Harold and for the English. In spring, April 1066, Halley's comet raced across the sky. Quote, through all England a sign such as men never saw before was seen in the heavens. You can even see the comet in the Bayeux Tapestry. Later chroniclers looking back on these dying days of Anglo-Saxon England would come to see the comet as an omen, a celestial warning of the catastrophe that was about to swallow Harold and the whole of England with him. How Harold felt looking up at the white flash of comet, we do not know. He might have felt a sense of foreboding with it as well. After all, he still had his exiled brother, Tostig, to worry about. Now that Edward the Confessor was gone, would Tostig try to fight his way back to his earldom? Maybe Tostig hoped that with his brother now king, he would be invited back into the fold for family unity, or at least to placate a potentially dangerous fuse. That did not happen. Harold must have known his brother well enough to realize Tostig wasn't going to just let past grudges slide. What he could not have known was how far Tostig would go to get what he wanted, even sacrificing England as they all knew it in the process. To quote the book, Harold, quote, underestimated the lengths to which his younger sibling would go to enable him to recover his position. Tostig's need for revenge would override anything else. The role he, Tostig, played in the downfall of Anglo-Saxon England cannot be underestimated.
And this is what I hinted at this earlier.
You
Maybe
did.
I should not have done that. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
It's one of the few things I could remember.
I don't think it's a spoiler when it's been almost 1,000 years. Is it almost 1,000 years? Or am I just really bad at math?
That's almost 1,000. You got to round up a little bit.
But close enough. The heavens had good reason to cast doom on England and on Harold. In exile, Tostig, playing the role of jealous brother, did the unthinkable. He went king shopping. Tostig wanted to play kingmaker. And Tostig, still seething with anger at his brother, would use his insider knowledge to help someone, anyone, do it. Sweyn, Forkbeard, and Canute had proved that an outsider, a foreigner, could successfully invade and conquer England. You could become king of England with all the riches and prestige that brought. Was a lesson that William, the new Duke of Normandy, would heed and follow with his trademark brutality. Duke William of Normandy would begin the process of preparing for invasion that spring of 1066. We just don't know if he was already in preparation when Tostig visited him, or if it was Tostig's visit that kicked off the Duke's decision to invade England, the chicken or the egg. Obviously, if you believe Duke William's later story about Harold's oath and Edward the Confessor's promise to pass the throne to him, maybe it was the former, that he had already started on work on a fleet that would take him to England. We know, however, that Tostig would not ultimately align himself with Duke William. Instead, he would put all his eggs in one basket, metaphorically, that of Harold Hardrada of Norway. I know, it's another Harold. We're going to call him Harold Hardrada, his full name, or Hardrada, to avoid confusion. Hardrada was king of Norway and a seasoned warrior. His exploits amazed the world. This is a man who everybody would know. He had gone so far as the Byzantine Empire, serving as one of the legendary Varangian Guards. Those were the soldiers who guarded the Byzantine emperor. They were his bodyguards. The prospect of a man with that kind of ruthless reputation landing on English shores was no small matter. Frankly, I would be a little terrified if I was in Harold's place. Tostig, still furious over his exile, convinced Hardrada to invade England to take the crown from his brother. One of the chroniclers creates Tostig's speech to Hardrada. We have no idea if this is even what he proposed, but it's worth sharing in case it hints at some truth to the matter. Tostig told Hardrada, quote, "Great king, I approach your throne, offering myself and my service in good faith, in the hope of being restored by your aid to the honor which is mine by right of inheritance. For Harold, my brother, has treacherously risen against me, and presumptuously, on false pretenses, made himself king of England. Destroy my brother's upstart strength and war. Keep half of England for yourself, and let me have the other half, to hold as your faithful vassal as long as I live." Basically splitting the kingdom in half if they succeed, which is a betrayal on multiple levels. That of an Englishman, that of a brother. He really does remind me of George, Duke of Clarence, who played a similar role of continuously betraying his brother, King Edward IV, before coming to a similarly disastrous end. It's always these brothers behind the king that create a lot of issues for them. You can see how messy the situation was turning out to be for Harold. There are now multiple men vying for the throne, his throne. We tend to break down the events of 1066 after the death of Edward the Confessor as Harold versus William. Simple, easy, but that's not the full story. You had these 4 separate claimants to the throne of England, 4 very different men. A young teenager with the right pedigree, the most powerful magnate in all of England, a duke hardened by a brutal childhood into someone dangerous, and a Viking warrior out of legend. And that's not even including the role that Harold's own brother, Tostig, played in the events of 1066. So those other men tend to get written out of the story because we know in hindsight that it would eventually come down to Harold versus William. But it is something to mention because, like I said, the simplified story is not the full story. Whatever small, very small amount of peace Harold had, it was shattered when he received reports of Duke William's ferocious work on a fleet. Harold would have known Duke William's intentions, leaving the English king watching the coast, waiting for invasion. He'd assembled some men in the south waiting for Duke William whenever he happened to show up. Harold had one piece of good luck. The weather had delayed the Normans. If it had not, he would have been dealing with 2 invasions at the same time. His luck ended there. While Duke William waited for better weather on the Channel, the Norse king, Harold Hardrada, along with Tostig, had landed on English shores. Harold had been so focused on the south, looking towards the Channel. Now an army of thousands poured into northern England. The bad news kept coming for Harold. On September 20th, 1066, Harold's brothers-in-law, Edwin and Morcar, the very men who had helped kick Tostig out of his earldom, were defeated by the invading forces. The Norse army had trapped much of the English force between a marsh and another group of Norsemen on their flank. So if you'd managed to survive up to that point, you likely drowned in the marsh. Some estimate the casualty rate at an eye-watering 30%. Just crazy to think about for a battle.
Yeah, that is astonishing.
Both earls, Edwin and Morcar, did manage to escape, but that was about as much luck as the English had that day. The all-important city of York fell 2 days later on September 22nd. Tostig must have been absolutely giddy, sweeping through the very lands that had tossed him out just a year earlier. And with that, the conquering army withdrew to Stamford Bridge near York to await exchanging of more hostages after the battle. Harold, who had been watching the channel up until this point, spurred into action. Disbanding the navy and men south, he headed north. The speed in which Harold assembled his own men, then marched the nearly 200 miles from London to York, only shows what an efficient leader he could be. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle informs us that, quote, he went northward by day and night as quickly as he could gather his army. So typically, infantry could move about 15 miles a day. Harold did an astronomical number of 35 miles per day. Because of the speed, Harold Hardrada, Tostig, and the rest of the Norse army had no idea Harold had made it that far north. He had gotten there before they even thought to really look for him. Somehow, as strange as it sounds, no scouts had been left behind in York or outside of it to tell the army that the king was only a few miles outside the city. Maintaining that secrecy would have been key to stopping this invasion before it got any further. When Harold and his army got to York in the early morning hours of September 25th, they realized they would face no opposition there, not a single Norse soldier in York. They rested for only about an hour or two before heading towards Stamford Bridge, where they knew Hardrada and his men camped. For their part, the Norse were having a lovely morning. They were just relaxing in the hot sun, their armor discarded. It was not until the English were nearly upon them that the Norse even knew they were there. Quote, they saw the cloud of dust raised by horses, and under it fine shields and shining coats of mail. The battle had begun before they had even known that Harold's army had arrived in the area. For Harold, it wasn't just facing down the invading Viking king, Harold Hardrada. His own brother Tostig stood across the battlefield from him. You have to imagine that if their father were still alive, he would have found some way, any way, to keep his sons from coming to this. But now the time for reconciliation had long since passed. The only solution to their disagreement would be death for one of them. According to one of the Norwegian sagas, before the main assault, the brothers would meet. Maybe it's just a tale, maybe not, but it rings so true to Harold and Tostig as men that I just have to mention it. The story says that Harold rode up to the Norse shield wall and called out to Tostig. He would grant him a third of England if he would lay down arms. Still burning with grievance, Tostig sneered, "That is a very different offer from the one I had last winter, when I was met with nothing but contempt and hostility. If I accept this, what will you give King Harold Hardrada for his trouble?" Harold did not mince words. 7 feet of English soil. A grave.
Ouch.
Tostig refused the offer, and Harold, with this last peace offering to his brother coming to nothing, rode back to prepare for the battle ahead of them. Hardrada, having watched the exchange, approached Tostig afterwards, asking, "Who was that man who spoke so well?" "That was my brother, the king," Tostig told him. Hardrada responded, "Too late were we told of that. They had approached our army so close this Harold would not have lived to tell of our men's death." Tostig's reply was simple, prophetic. "I would rather he slay me than I him." The Battle of Stamford Bridge would be exceptionally bloody, and it would not be until afternoon that a major break happened. Late in the afternoon, Harold's forces managed to shoot Harold Hardrada through the neck as he led a charge out of the shield wall. The legendary warrior, a man plucked out of the sagas, was dead. A Norwegian saga tells us that after Hardrada's death, Harold appealed to his brother Tostig. Stop the battle now, and Harold would give him a pardon along with the other Norse fighters. Whether his hatred of his brother blinded him to the hopeless situation around him, or he felt like he had a duty to follow through with what he had started, Tostig would not accept amnesty. No. He would be killed soon after, and his body was recovered and laid to rest in York Minster. Harold allowed the surviving Norsemen, including Hardrada's sons, to board their ships and sail home. Whether Harold mourned his brother, we'll never know. Tostig had put him through so much. Too much had passed between them, perhaps too much even for death to pacify. Yet it was still his brother. Harold had no time to dwell on this loss, if he did at all, because he had defeated one invading force, but now another had landed on England's shores. By September 29th, Harold heard the news. Duke William of Normandy had arrived. Worse yet, he had landed on the other side of the country in Sussex, more than 200 miles away from Harold and his victorious army. It was already late in the year as September slipped into October. This meant the close of the campaigning season, so just surprising that Duke William even attempted this invasion so late in the year. Yet improbably he had. This meant, though, that William really needed a quick battle to glory or to death. He would not have the resources to wander a freezing England for a whole winter. Logistics and medieval warfare, supply trains, these were as vital as military strategy and battle or weaponry. If William could not take Harold to battle for the crown and soon, he'd need to return home to Normandy. If Harold had just waited after Stamford Bridge, let Duke William do his thing, raise the countryside, blow off steam, the course of history might have been different. Harold's men could have rested. A triumphant army is still an exhausted one. Instead, Harold gambled it all. Just as he rushed to battle against Harold Hardrada, he would go to William. He would finish the last pretender to the throne. He would go into winter and the new year, 1067, with peace of mind, his throne undisputed. Harold had made up his mind. He moved towards William, towards Hastings. The question is why? You can factor in adrenaline after defeating the undefeatable Harold Hardrada, maybe a bit of cockiness too, with that victory at Stamford Bridge. A post-battle high must account for at least some of the decision. However, it still seems foolish for Harold to rush to battle after having just done so. We talked about how crazy a pace he had gone north. It had been a remarkable feat just to get an army north so quickly.
Yeah, I have to confess, I'm not entirely sure I believe some of those numbers, but, history is not the past. It's the debate over the records of the past.
But he got there quickly, regardless.
Oh, yeah, and I have no doubt about that because I think we can be reasonably confident in the dates. And we do have to remember that when we look at these campaigns, the Stamford Bridge, it's not really a campaign. It's
a battle.
It's a set piece battle, but it's not like it's a combined effort. I mean, in theory, if he loses that battle, then Hardrada is going to be next up to claim the throne and conceivably would be resisting William himself. They're not acting in concert with one another.
No.
It's not like you should see William's landing as like a joint amphibious operation. That's not what's going on.
Although they could have, like I said, if not for some of the weather.
They could have tried.
They could have landed at the same time, even uncoordinated.
Right.
Except for the weather. William was planning.
Yeah, he was delayed.
Who knows what would have happened then? There would have had to be some delegation. Harold couldn't go to both, but yeah, this is not a coordinated effort. They're not going to share the throne. Each wants it for themselves. It does seem strange that, you pull off the impossible, and now, even though we know it's not exactly the same army that goes south, he's still rushing south. Could you really count on pulling it off again? It was so improbable the first time. And then also, why go south yourself? There are stories in the chronicles that indicate Harold's remaining younger brothers begging Harold to stay out of it, let them go and fight William. So one of the chroniclers gives Gurth a speech. Might not be word for word what he said. The message would have been similar. He told Harold, quote, "Stay here in London, but let me have your troops. I will take the risk and do battle with William. But if I'm conquered or captured, you, who would still be alive, could, if it pleases God, gather your troops together to do battle." Leofwine, the other brother, added to this, "If you enter the list yourself, you may be put to flight or killed, whereas if we alone fight, you will be able to restore the situation if we flee and avenge us if we fail." That would have been probably the prudent move, the best move, to allow his brothers to fight in his place. If they lost, then, as they said, at least Harold would still have a chance to regroup and fight another day for his crown. Harold refused. He would not send others to their deaths if he did not take the risk himself. You have to admire that about the man. He could have easily let others die to save himself, but he did not. Once again, why? So most historians point to the location of where Duke William had landed and started his pillaging campaign. It was Godwin country. The most obvious explanation is it was personal pride. To have someone destroying your own heartland, the lands of your father, Harold would not allow that to happen. That's why most people think Harold did what he did. He stopped north of London at his church in Waltham to pray. He'd need every ounce of divine favor he could get. Supposedly, 2 monks were sent along with him to recover Harold's body if it came down to that. By the 10th of October, before the full conscripts had even arrived, Harold left London on his final ride towards his destiny. On October 14th, at about 9 a.m., 3 hours after the sun had risen, the Battle of Hastings began. The Norman mounted knights gave their side an edge. At one point, the Normans pretended to retreat, only to turn around and kill the pursuing English soldiers to a man. The battle dragged on, hours of slaughter. We are told that Duke William had 3 horses killed beneath him. The Normans had seen him fall, fearing their duke had been killed, and all had been lost. Instead, Duke William popped up and rallied his troops. "Look at me, I am alive, and with God's help I will conquer. What way is open to escape? Not one of you will escape death by flight," Duke William supposedly told his troops. To prove the point, the Duke lifted his helmet above him. Any man could now see the Duke remained alive. England would soon find out the make of William the Conqueror. But before he could be king, he had to get through Harold. And that was within reach. The hours of battle had taken its toll on the English. By the late afternoon, the dead and wounded piled up, leaving the remaining men at the mercy of the Norman cavalry. The English shield wall improbably still held, but just barely. Duke William must have known this was the moment that he had been waiting for. If he could win now, the crown was his. But if the sun set with Harold still alive, reinforcements would surely arrive and the Duke would be outnumbered. So with that, Duke William made one last push to break through the English. With bowmen slinging arrows and the cavalry outmanning the exhausted English, Harold stood firm in what would be his last stand. The shield wall buckled and broke with the pressure. Harold's younger brothers, Leofwine and Gareth, earls in their own right, died holding off the Normans. There are conflicting stories whether the brothers died earlier in battle or alongside Harold. But I like to picture the Godwinsons together until the very end, a sea of Norman knights and this band of brothers. Their father had left them a legacy to uphold, and they would die trying to keep it. At dusk, King Harold, son of Godwin, keeper of a dynasty, perished among the fighting. The story that has passed down to us through the Bayeux Tapestry of him meeting his end with an arrow through the eye might not be true. There has been some work done on the tapestry, and the reference to Harold's death might be referring to another scene with a man getting cut down. There's other chroniclers who claim that Duke William assembled what sounds like a hit squad, a kill squad, which went in to kill the king. In that story, one managed to cut through Harold's shield and chest, while another spilled Harold's entrails with a spear. Part of his thigh was cut from his body, and by the time the knights finished him, Harold would be unrecognizable. Arrow or axe, the Normans had killed the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. When night fell, leaving the bodies in shadow, England had a new king, William the Conqueror. Battle Abbey in Norman Abbey stands where, according to legend, Harold was killed. So today you can still see the place that supposedly marks where Harold fell in battle. We mentioned in part 1, when we talked about Edith Swanneck, that she, Harold's handfasted wife, was sent to identify the fallen king. She did quote, by certain marks, not by his face, for he had been despoiled of all signs of status. This is where, again, confirmed that he probably was disfigured, maimed in some way after the battle, if not during. The late king's body would be taken back to Waltham Abbey, a poignant spot as that is where he had prayed before leaving London. The only thing that remained of Harold would be his bloodline. Harold's wives and children would be scattered across Europe after the conquest, trying to find some place to make their home out of William the Conqueror's reach. Tracking them can be difficult. There would be a few ill-fated attempts to reclaim their father's throne with no success. Nothing that amounted to much. Exile and obscurity would be their fates. One of his daughters did manage to marry into the royal family of Kiev. There is an Eastern European legacy of Harold Godwin or Godwinson. In England, however, the Godwin dynasty had come to an abrupt end. And with that, we will pick up what happened next to William the Conqueror and all in England with Jamie's episode on him coming up soon. You know what that means. We have arrived.
No. We have to judge? Well, you have to go first, don't you? This was your choice.
I know, I do.
I'm willing to go first, but I kind of think I should defer to you.
I went into this thinking, I was like, well, Harold, he promised William that he would support him. So I thought that that was going to be the main crux of the judgment. That would be the main thing that would probably make me at least side-eye Harold. Doing this research, I don't blame him. And I don't think that Edward the Confessor or Harold ever promised the crown to Duke William. I think William saw an opportunity and he was, if anything, an opportunist and decided to do what Canute and Sweyn Forkbeard had done before and try to take the crown. I don't think he was ever promised. If you take out the part of Oathbreaker of Harold's story, you really are left with a man who, yes, when he dies, he's not old at all. I should have mentioned that it's about mid-40s, about maybe 44, 45. Not young for the time, but middle-aged. He just didn't have time to cement himself as king. But from everything that I've read, it seems like even the Normans begrudgingly think that he was a pretty impressive figure, that as an earl, and even in the short period of time, if not for the succession issue, if he had just been the son of a king and had come to the throne in a more normal manner, I think there'd be much more positive. Not that his legacy is wholly negative, but I do think, the Norman legacy, the Norman version of events does get passed down because of the winners. They get to write the story. In the past, when I've learned of Harold, I've always been like, oh, well, he stole the throne. He's no different than somebody like Stephen, who later will steal the throne from Matilda and the Anarchy, which comes about, 100 years later. I kind of saw Harold in the same vein, but going through this, if I had to give a number.
I think you do have to give a number. That's normally what we do.
I know.
And then sometimes you and I don't agree, and then that's fun for listeners.
I feel like 80-20 or higher, positive.
Damn.
What? Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, I have him at 80.
Oh.
I have him. That's very boring if we agree. That's no fun.
No, but this might be our first one where I think for all the other ones we've argued.
I think our reasoning might be different.
Well, what's your reasoning? For me, it's just I was really focused on him as an oath breaker. And now I can see that while Edward the Confessor might not have
proclaimed him king on his deathbed.
Yeah, if we take away the deathbed thing that could possibly be misconstrued, even if we erase that, I do think he was the best man for the job. Edgar the Etheling, he was too young. If we had picked up the story 10 years later and Edgar the Etheling was 25 and Harold decided to usurp the throne from him, it might be a different story, but he was the best man on the ground for it. We're still in a time where bloodline's important, dynasty's important, but to be a king, you have to have the money and the military might, and that's all things Harold had. If you discount that, the only other real thing that you could really count against him is if you thought that he was plotting against Tostig.
That he helped to orchestrate the uprising.
Yeah, if you think he either orchestrated it or if maybe he didn't orchestrate it, whether he was thinking about the succession and trying to eliminate Tostig as a claimant.
That my stock will rise if my brother stumbles. Yeah, I suppose that's a possibility.
Or if he was like, ooh, this is a good opportunity. Yeah, even if he didn't plan it that way. But again, we talked about why, even if he had been able to, should he have put Tostig back? Probably not. that was a disaster waiting to happen. If you take those things away, I think even if you compare him to his father, Godwin had Edward the Confessor's brother, Alfred's blood on his hands. If you make that comparison, I think Harold's even better than his dad. I'm sure he was pretty ruthless, but it's kind of what you had to be an effective earl or king in those days.
Yeah, he wouldn't be a name that we know today if there hadn't been a certain degree of calculation and cunning behind his rise. My logic, I get to the same numbers, but I kind of have a different road that gets me there.
Give it to me.
Well, the first thing I would say, just because it lets me reach into something I do know a little bit about, is that the cultural differences between Saxon England and what we would now call, Norman continental Europe, they are pretty profound. There is a tendency that this is a crime, this is a mistake in historical scholarship, but certainly British historians felt compelled to do it anyway. This kind of presentism, where you go back and you look at the last Saxon king and you think about all of the pillars of Saxon cultural identity that you're going to lose with the arrival of the Normans. And I don't think he's aware of it. Harold doesn't know that everyone's going to be literally speaking a different language for generations to come.
All the aristocrats, all the nobles are going to be replaced by Norman nobles.
The words we see as foul and crass and low will be Saxon words, and the French equivalent will be the language of culture and sophistication and the top rung of the hierarchy. But he is aware, and this is kind of an astonishing truth, but generations upon generations before Henry, before the Tudor conflict with the Catholic Church, the English church at this time operated with a lot of independence. Most of its officials were appointed by elite Saxon families, and they even did a lot of worship and even some gospel translations, into the vernacular. This is long before there's ever a debate about whether or not Tyndale's Bible can be on a bookshelf in Great Britain, because there is no Great Britain yet.
Don't you dare try to speak the Bible in English.
Right. Keep it in Latin. So I think he is aware that there is something to defend. Now, I think he still equates it with his family identity. He doesn't necessarily think of it as English nationalism, because I think, to a modern observer, you look at the tapestry, you look at his tragic death, and you say, oh, this is when our very nature was plowed up from under us and we became an occupied people, right?
We've lost something there.
Right. I don't think he's conscious that those are the stakes, but I also think it's wrong to say that, dare I use the word, it's wrong to say that he doesn't have a sense of patriotic duty to his people. It's just he more closely equates his people literally with his blood. So that's one thing I would point out in his favor, although that's kind of a 50-50 thing, right? I don't think he's necessarily deservedly called the icon of English identity, but I also don't think that he's ignorant of those things. He knows what makes his community, his people different from what exists on the other side of the channel.
He knows because Edward the Confessor is very Norman. That was, remember, a huge showdown that created problems between the king and the Godwins, because there's that other Norman faction. He had brought over Normans before, right. So yeah, there's already been that conflict before.
Yeah, and that to me is the cinching, that's the bow that you put on top of the analysis, because if you look at the three other variables that we might take into account, we can't really judge him as a king. He never gets a chance to govern in his own right.
No.
He's obviously a very effective, pragmatic earl, but he's in the field. He doesn't get the chance to lead in a traditional sense. So now we come to the third item, which is, well, okay, as a commander, is he too quick to turn south? Which is a very a kind of esoteric military question. How quickly should you? I
am in no place to make any judgments on that. And people much smarter than me have said, that he should have waited.
Nobody today could make that analysis. Yeah. I think any historian who claims to be able to judge that question. I did do a little research indicating that there is some evidence that he had different factions within his own council, some of whom advised him, well, obviously, his own family members advised him, wait.
let us go. I mean, that actually would have
Right.
probably been the smartest thing, because there's no reason that he personally had to go.
The alternative, though, is that when an occupying power has established a beachhead, the ideal time to strike is before they have consolidated that beachhead, because they're still dependent upon the sea for their supplies. You can almost imagine William hearing about Stamford and thinking to himself, oh, there's been an epic confrontation here. I have some time. I have some breathing room.
Yeah, I've definitely got time.
So this would be the perfect moment for Harold to strike. To me, that's 6 one way, half a dozen the other.
You know, what I had mentioned and what a lot of people say is you are approaching the end of the campaign season. He's not going to be able to stay there all winter. So if Harold just even waited, I know it's bad to let William go off into the countryside and start pillaging, killing your peasants, killing livestock. Not ideal, not ideal. But if you wait a little bit, at some point he's going to have to go back because he doesn't have the resources. And Normandy is notoriously, the nobles there are always a little bit unruly, even for somebody as terrifying as Duke William the Conqueror.
He might have to go back just to maintain his own authority.
We'll see once he does become king. There's still the back and forth. He's got to go back to take care of some things. So if Harold had just waited.
You have to weigh that, though, against the potential disaffection of your own people.
Yes, exactly.
What's his strategy for pushing these foreign boots of occupation off our soil? Well, his strategy is logistically very clever. He's going to wear them down just through staring at them while they burn our crops and poison our wells. And it's just that's a politically dangerous approach.
It's one thing if you've been a king for many years and you do that, but when you've only been king for not even a year, much more difficult to make that calculus, even if it's Godwin country, even if it's an area that is historically supportive of the Godwins. If people are coming in and the king's not protecting you, what's to say that they don't just join with Duke William and be like, fine, we'll do whatever. We'll serve in your army. We just don't want you taking our sheep and killing our people.
So if we move past the question of presentism, are we projecting onto him an English patriotic identity that didn't quite exist yet? And if we move past the question of, is he a good king, a rightful king? Well, we don't really know, because he has to spend more time as a general than anything else, a field marshal, if you will. If we move past the question of, because to me it's a tie, right? Is he too quick to turn south? I think that leaves us with the silly final arbiter of his score, which is the oath. And the oath argument,
it falls apart once you start looking into it.
Not only that, but it's utterly ridiculous, because now I get to, I'm always grasping for things I can pull off of the tree of my own knowledge.
Grasp away.
So having studied a lot of common law history and British constitutionalism, which I had to take some classes in that.
When you study British law, do they make you wear the wigs like you're a barrister?
No, no, because that
should be part of the class.
That would be disrespectful of no. They do still have to wear the wigs.
I know. I'm sorry, Brits, but how can we take you seriously when you're wearing those?
They did have, it's a pronunciation obstacle course, but the Witanyamot, the Council of Wise Saxon Men, no matter what he said when he was on the continent, he knows that by Saxon tradition, that council is supposed to have the final say on who sits on the throne.
Edward can't promise anything. Harold can't promise anything.
Right.
Even if Edward had given Harold the throne at the deathbed, it was still up to the Witan. And the Witan said, it's Harold. So that means it's Harold.
And the Norman Chronicles are full of people rebelling against William. And although they are punished for it, many of them fall back into his good graces and they never lose their lands over it. So it doesn't matter if you look at the great-great-great-great-grandparent of continental law or the great-great-great-great-grandparent of English common law, which admittedly, common law and constitutional law are not necessarily the same thing. But the whole idea that some oath you made on St. Peter's big toe is both of them would have known that was utterly ridiculous. So I'm going to give him 80-20 and say he fought bravely. He almost won, and I don't consider him to be a usurper. I don't consider him to be dishonest. For the first time, I think you and I have delivered the same score.
This makes me happy. I don't like when we disagree.
like on Mark Antony.
I try really hard to get you on my side, and I still feel like secretly, deep down, I was right about that one.
Oh, maybe we'll have to do a sequel episode to that.
Maybe. Well, I think Julius Caesar's on the list. Would be similar. So go back to Roman times at some point. I love when we agree. It just makes things so much easier when you agree with me.
Who wants to listen to two people agree for an hour and a half?
Apparently, whoever downloads this episode.
Is there anything going on in the United States of America right now that implies that that's what people want?
That's true.
Well, actually, what they want is to listen to people who are just reaffirming their own worldview.
Well, we're reaffirming our own. I'm excited. I know that the show King and Conquer is going to come out here at some point. I don't think they've given us a date. It's either going to air on Amazon or HBO or one of them.
Let me guess, in this version of medieval history, people will have much better hair and teeth.
Oh, I just sent you. James Norton plays Harold. He wins for hotness.
Oh, that's a handsome man.
If you're in England and you've already watched it, let us know what you think. I've seen some mixed things about it. I know, obviously, it's not 100% historically accurate, but still fun to see all the events of Edward the Confessor, Harold, and the Battle of Hastings play out. I still want to watch it and see how everything is portrayed. Good to get Harold and the whole Godwin family back into public consciousness. William the Conqueror, most people have, even if they don't know necessarily who he is, they've heard of him, but Harold, not so much. So I'm hoping that the show does well and that we get more Harold content.
All for it.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys for following along on this journey as we talked about King Harold. And like I said at the top, if you guys like it, like the episode, like the show.
Agree, disagree. Maybe you're 2080 instead of 8020.
Yeah, you could tell us if we're wrong.
Maybe our pronunciation of something was brutally incorrect. I'm sure that's
probably true. 100%. I tried to listen to how things are pronounced, but sometimes even when I listen to it, as Matt knows, sometimes even when I know how it's supposed to be said, my mouth can't do it. And this is where I hope you don't ask me to do the word that we both know I cannot say, at least not say reliably.
Oh, see, now everyone listening is going to wonder what that word. It's a French word.
It is. What is it? You can tell them.
Erin, could you tell listeners what word we use in French for somebody who's trying to start their own business?
Oh, shoot. And see, now this is really bad when I'm under stress. It would be entrepreneur.
I think that's it.
Sometimes it gets really weird in there. It gets entrepreneur.
Yeah, well, what happens is you come close to finishing and then you doubt yourself.
Well, if you say it like a million times, it loses all meaning. But yes, I can't believe I did that on cue. So I feel like that's as good of a place as any to leave this because I'm going to go on a high note before I mispronounce.
Well, not only is that a good place to leave, but that's an example of a French word that migrated into English as a product of the Norman conquest.
I wish that I was clever enough to have brought it full circle like that. I'm not, but I'm going to pretend I am. So thank you guys for listening. We'll be picking up with William the Conqueror's story. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.